For 30 years, Vincent Gigante wandered the streets of New York's Greenwich Village, dressed in a tattered bathrobe and babbling endlessly to himself. To the FBI, he was believed to be the boss of New York's most powerful mafia organization, the Genovese crime family. Was Gigante crazy, or was his behavior a shrewd attempt to disguise his position as a ruthless mafia boss? That question would take years to answer.
Every family has eccentrics, even crime families. Crime boss Vincent Gigante, head of New York's Genovese family, was undoubtedly eccentric. The question remained, was he truly mad? Justice rested on the answer. Outwardly, he roamed the streets as a doggedly old man, barely in touch with reality. But in the eyes of the law, he was a cunning conspirator and responsible for murder. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former director of the FBI's New York office. Organized crime takes a concerted effort to crack. The FBI is devoted to cracking it. The case against Gigante hinged on his ability to stand trial. Was his strange behavior an act of madness or a stroke of genius?
Anyone who witnessed Gigante's ravings would have found it hard to believe that he controlled the largest and most profitable family in the New York Mafia, an organization with a long and bloody history. The origins of the Mafia can be traced back to 13th century feudal Sicilian society. Bands of Sicilian families organized themselves to rebel against the oppressive and ruthless French invaders. Mafia, the acronym for the Italian Morta alla Francia Italia Anela, which translates to death to the French is Italy's cry, became the name that these organized families used to refer to themselves, its meaning synonymous with men of honor. By the 19th century, the Mafia re-emerged in Sicily as a purely criminal culture, mostly hiring themselves out to wealthy landowners to oppress upstart peasants. More and more, the goal of the Mafia became focused on how to generate illegal profits. The tradition continued as waves of Italians emigrated to New York in the 1920s. Most immigrants lived in cramped and poor conditions. As a result of growing ethnic tensions, Sicilian Americans became the target of growing resentment. They needed Mafia protection more and more. Louis Scilero, a third-generation Italian-American, is head of the FBI's New York field office. A 23-year veteran, he is an expert on the Mafia and its intricate structure.
When they first became prevalent in New York City, it primarily victimized members of the immigrant community, where in lower Manhattan they became the victims of extortions and protection rackets. And that's how the Cosa Nostra families originally got their start.
With Prohibition, influence of the crime families grew out from the isolated neighborhoods and began to spread nationwide. A new form of underworld cooperation emerged. Various crime families across America banded together to supply illegal alcohol to a country willing to pay for it.
I think that probably more than anything gave the Italian gangs, the Italian Cosa Nostra families, a foothold in American society. Not only from an organizational standpoint, but certainly from a financial base. Since Prohibition, certainly they then expanded into other areas.
Operating outside the law meant the Mafia had to police itself. For an organization animated by self-interest and greed, there would always be conflict and opposition. An elite group of killers were organized to enforce Mafia rules, thereby ensuring its survival. This group of mob enforcers came to be known as Murder, Inc. By the early 1940s, Murder, Inc. would be responsible for hundreds of mob-related murders nationwide. The powerful New York bosses during the Mafia's early years, Lucky Luciano and Frank Costello, set up a ruling body for the Mafia, responsible for delegating territories and duties among the various gangs nationwide. Home for America's 5 largest families, New York remained the center of the Mafia's expanding foothold in America. It remains so to this day.
The 5 New York families consist currently of the Gambino family, the Bonanno, the Lucchese, the Colombo, and the Genovese family. Each of those families are also members of the Commission and also have their base in New York City.
The Commission, composed of the bosses of the 5 New York families, acts as a criminal board of directors, settling disputes between families and making major decisions on Mafia business. Each family is governed by its administration, comprised of the boss, the underboss, and the consigliere, or counselor, who are responsible for directing their family's criminal activity. Below the administration in the family hierarchy are the captains. The captains are the leaders of crews of soldiers, the men responsible for carrying out the day-to-day criminal activity. To become a soldier, properly known as a wise guy or good fella, an individual has to first be made or officially inducted into the secret society. He must blindly obey the rules of Cosa Nostra, Italian for this thing of ours. He is sworn to put the family ahead of all else. If he is asked to kill, he must faithfully do so. It was against this backdrop, a bustling immigrant community with an expanding Cosa Nostra influence, that Vincent Gigante grew up. His parents came from Naples and settled in Lower Manhattan. Vincent finished 8th grade and started trade school, but soon dropped out. Less than a decade later, Gigante became a wise guy in the Genovese crime family. Vincent Gigante's crime career spanned a turbulent time in American Mafia history. The mob had expanded its reach into legitimate businesses, the various families fighting to control them. And in the ensuing turf wars, violence was often the final arbiter. The family that Gigante attached himself to was steeped in Cosa Nostra's American origins. The infamous Charles Lucky Luciano, responsible for organizing and structuring the American Mafia, was the family's first boss until he was imprisoned in 1936. As a result, Luciano's family administration, Frank Costello, nicknamed the Prime Minister of the Underworld, and Vito Genovese, fought for control of the family. Costello won out, but Vito Genovese began plotting his takeover. A young Vincent Gigante first gained notoriety as a mobster in 1957 when he attempted to murder Frank Costello. Within the Mafia, it was widely believed that Vito Genovese had ordered the hit to get rid of his rival. Gigante's bullet only grazed Costello's head, but apparently Costello got the message. Soon after the shooting, he put out word that he was retiring. Vito Genovese was now the boss of the family that would take his name. Gigante was arrested for attempted murder and brought to trial, but the case was dismissed for lack of a witness. The location and angle of Costello's wound indicated he probably saw the would-be assassin, but at the trial, he failed to identify Gigante as the shooter. Even for an ousted boss, the oath of secrecy remained sacred. Gigante continued to make money for the Genovese family through illegal enterprises. 2 years after the failed assassination attempt, he was arrested and convicted of narcotics violations. He received a 7-year sentence. Convicted mobsters are expected to do their time and remain silent. If Gigante served his time and kept his mouth shut, he would be rewarded after his release. It was up to Gigante to figure out how to avoid future arrests. He was a model prisoner, neat, polite, and willing to take on any job. Gigante's cooperation was so impressive that some prison officials wrote glowing reports. He was released early from the federal penitentiary in Lewisburg for good behavior when he was 35 years old. Gigante now devised a secret plan that he hoped would prevent his return to prison forever. He didn't want to leave his Mafia life or give up his shot at becoming the boss of the family. After his release in 1964, Gigante's public behavior began to grow bizarre. He became a frequent sight on the streets of Greenwich Village. Gigante could be found wandering the neighborhood, appearing disoriented and mentally unstable. Not long after he left prison, Gigante learned of a police investigation over his association with known mobsters. In 1969, he was indicted for attempting to bribe New Jersey police officers. Allegedly, he offered them money in exchange for information about surveillance and ongoing investigations in the Genovese family. Now, at almost 40 years old, he returned to his mental disability as a foil and checked himself into a psychiatric hospital for the first time. To support his story, Gigante and his relatives began to revise his medical history. While Gigante was at Lewisburg, his mother had been required to fill out a detailed family history. She said Vincent was a healthy, happy child. She noted only a speech impediment and a slight heart murmur. He had been a boxer, but never had a serious injury. By the time of the 1969 indictment, however, Gigante's lawyers claimed he was not competent to stand trial. His family suddenly remembered a host of mental problems. He had been given to severe temper tantrums. He had a phobia for the dark. He had been truant from school. He was at one time obese and had learning problems. The incompetency argument worked. Gigante never stood trial for the 1969 bribery charges. That same year, Gigante's boss, Vito Genovese, died of heart failure while serving a prison sentence for narcotics trafficking. In the decade that followed, the Genovese family was so secretive that for law enforcement, it was difficult to tell exactly who the boss was. Even had the FBI been able to identify the Genovese family leadership, making a case against them was another story. Witnesses were hard to come by. Mobsters who violated the sacred oath faced certain death. The best the FBI could do was to go after individual crimes. There were no laws that focused on bringing down the entire criminal family. As Gigante was moving up in the family, the federal government was about to make the FBI's job a little easier. In 1970, Congress passed the Racketeer Influences and Corrupt Organization Act, better known as the RICO laws.
What the racketeering law allowed us to do was to look at the family as a criminal enterprise and to attack the family as a criminal act. That became much more effective if you look back from the mid-70s to the 80s in terms of actually indicting the entire family and the entire hierarchy of that family.
The RICO laws require that the government prove that Mafia families are essentially criminal enterprises. They must show that the crimes committed by the boss and members of his family are committed to either expand the criminal enterprise or to increase a family member's position within that enterprise. To successfully bring down a family, the government has to prove that any one of several criminal acts, ranging from racketeering and extortion to murder, has been committed. By 1979, now armed with federal legislation aimed directly at organized crime, the FBI had devoted teams to exclusively focus investigations on the 5 major families. The FBI's Genovese squad finally learned that Vincent Gigante was on a fast track with the family. Special Agent Richard Rudolph had been assigned to investigate the Genovese crime family.
Through informants and other law enforcement agencies were exchanging information, we became aware that Mr. Gigante was an individual with much respect in the Genovese crime family and operated out of an area in Lower Manhattan. Because he was an up-and-coming person with a lot of respect within the family, we began to do some surveillances of Mr. Gigante.
With the FBI continuing to build its arsenal against organized crime, Gigante's cat and mouse game intensified. He stepped up his public show of mental disorder. In the late 70s and into the 80s, he was admitted 5 more times for psychiatric treatment. The FBI continued to keep tabs on Gigante. Agents learned that he frequented the Triangle Social Club, a gathering place for Genovese crime figures.
He could be found there almost on a daily basis. He lived in the neighborhood. He was an individual that could be found there in the late afternoons and into the early hours of the morning. And people would come to see him as opposed to him going to see other people.
Though Gigante's association in the Genovese family seemed certain to investigators, Gigante's family and doctors continuously told investigators that he led a very narrow existence. They said his whole world was confined to the block where he lived and the church he attended with his mother. He was barely functional at home and could not care for himself, they said. But with every passing day, the FBI and New York police were seeing a very different Vincent Gigante. In the early 1980s, the Mafia in the Northeast went through a particularly tumultuous time with several killings. Internal disputes within the family resulted in a string of assassinations. The FBI suspected Gigante was responsible for these gangland executions, especially those intended as punishment for breaking Cosa Nostra rules. Gigante was known to be a traditionalist. He wanted the rules obeyed, and when they were broken, retribution was sure to follow. It started with the murder of Philadelphia crime boss Angelo Bruno. Although Bruno's family was well outside New York, all families answered to the members of the commission. Gigante was upset because Bruno had been assassinated by his own men in a grab for control of the family. A Cosa Nostra rule had been violated. No one can kill a boss unless the commission sanctions it, and they seldom do. It was rumored that Gigante himself launched an investigation into Bruno's murder. Retribution was swift. Less than a month later, Tony Bananas Caponegro, identified as one of Bruno's assassins, was found dead. He had been shot 15 times and stabbed in the back. His body was stuffed in a trunk, and $20 bills were littered around his body, a clear message that he was killed for his greed. On the same day, another body was discovered. This time it was Fred Salerno, dead of gunshot wounds, dumped in a vacant lot. He too had allegedly participated in Bruno's murder. Phil Testa had taken Angelo Bruno's place as boss. His reign was short. Almost a year after Bruno's execution, Testa was blown up entering his own home. Another boss killed without the blessing of the commission. Another avenging act would follow. Rocco Marinucci was next, found dead with fireworks stuffed in his mouth. A gesture designed to show that he was killed for the way in which he had killed Testa. If the Cosa Nostra was to flourish, all of its members had to comply with its rules. There were no exceptions. Gigante was believed to have ordered the murder of one of his own crime family members. Genovese soldier Jerry Papa had murdered 2 Colombo family members without permission. As punishment for his unsanctioned act, he was brutally shot and killed by members of his own criminal family. Had Gigante become the enforcer for the Northeast Cosa Nostra? Informers within the mob told federal agents that all of these killings had been ordered by Gigante. But information given by admitted criminals is always a problem for potential juries. Criminals will say anything if their cooperation can be traded for a reduced prison sentence. The FBI needed more than the words of criminals looking for a deal. Gigante knew this, and he protected himself accordingly. It seemed that Gigante was now the boss. The FBI began a more focused surveillance effort on Gigante. They learned that the Genovese family had also infiltrated several of New York's major industries: the garment trade, trucking, garbage collection, airport cargo handling, and the city's seafood industry. Vincent Gigante was known on the streets as the Chin, an abbreviation of Cinzino, Little Vincent. Fearing FBI surveillance and wiretaps, family members were not allowed to speak his name. They were to refer to him with hand signals, touching their chins to communicate his nickname. Bringing down the Chin was going to take every bit of know-how that the FBI could muster. They were going to have to create their own luck. As a surveillance team member watched one day, a telling crack in the Chin's ruse appeared. The seemingly frail man was being helped across a busy street. When oncoming traffic threatened, he became suddenly animated, racing to safety. His helplessness somehow overtook him again on the other side. Clearly, there were 2 Gigantes, the mentally troubled one displayed to the public, and the determined boss of the Genovese administration. The FBI would soon learn of a 3rd. Gigante's ex-wife and their 5 children lived in New Jersey while he maintained a relationship with his long-standing companion, Olympia Esposito. He usually called on her late at night, looking quite dapper before he was aware of the surveillance.
We learned that he frequently visited a townhouse which was located up on 77th Street and the east side of Manhattan, where we later learned that a common law, he was living with his common law wife, and he had been married previously, and this was his second family there at this residence.
Soon the FBI knew all of the Chin's hangouts. This gave surveillance teams an opportunity to observe Gigante without his knowledge. A major break came when NYPD Organized Crime Task Force member Detective Tom Bruno was able to snap photos of some of Gigante's activities.
In 1984, I was assigned to a joint organized crime task force. That task force consisted of FBI agents and New York City police officers, detectives. And we were assigned to investigate the Genovese crime family. Then the next step was to go to Sullivan Street, where Chin Gigante lived. His apartment was above a pet store, alleged pet store. And he also had a social club on the block. And when you'd go by the social club, you'd see numerous people that were in the photos. And you'd see them standing in front of, going inside, and then sometimes crossing the street, going to the pet store, which was where the Chin, we believe, met people. Pet store really never had any kind of business that we could see. It had a little cat box in the window, and basically that was it.
More and more, Gigante was seen acting normally when he was unaware he was being watched.
I see Chin Gigante and I see Andrew Gigante, which is his son, come out of his residence. And I'm just minding my business, walking up the block. Andrew leaves to get in his car, and Chin is standing on the corner, and he wasn't helped out of his building, and he was standing on the corner. Andrew gets in his car, pulls out. As he pulls out, there's a car coming up Sullivan Street. It blows the horn. Chin Gigante yells, "Hey, what are you, in a rush?" As he does this, I come into the lighted area. He looks, sees me, and all of a sudden his head goes down, and he plays the sick point.
Another break followed Detective Bruno's surveillance successes. The FBI managed to rent an apartment close to the townhouse of Gigante's companion, Ms. Esposito. An agent would exit through a back door in the rented apartment building and position himself about 50 feet from Ms. Esposito's townhouse. From there, Ms. Esposito and Gigante could be seen from time to time. An agent watched the couple for 4 months between midnight and 2 a.m. Assistant U.S. Attorney Andrew Weissman, who later would have to prove Gigante's competency to stand trial, was delighted with the agent's observations.
And lo and behold, when he was inside in a place where he didn't think he was being observed, he did all of the normal things that any of us would do. As a matter of fact, what was unusual about those surveillances was that there was nothing unusual about him. He was normal. He was talking to people. He was counting money. He never wore a shoddy bathrobe. Indeed, the only time he was seen in a bathrobe was, not surprisingly, when he got out of the shower. He would wear a nice, fluffy, Brooks Brothers type bathrobe, which was not at all like the bathrobe that he would wear when he was on the street. So it became pretty obvious to the people conducting the surveillance that he was engaging in a concerted effort to give an appearance to the public that was false, that was not the way he behaved in real life.
Investigators continued to watch Gigante's bizarre public behavior. But photos themselves are only a single link in proving criminal activity. Investigators needed hard evidence to corroborate what the photos were suggesting, that Gigante was in fact the boss. One wiretap conversation between Genovese crew members gave investigators more proof of Gigante's position in the family. On the tapes, known Genovese members were complaining about the chin. Assistant U.S. Attorney George Stamboulidis reviewed these tapes to help prepare a case against Gigante.
He's constantly nitpicking his men, trying to always, with a million questions, drilling them and questioning them on what they're involved in. He's always looking to get money from them, or money from some of the schemes and how he earned, and how much money he would make from the gambling operations at the Triangle Social Club and things like that.
While Gigante micromanaged the internal affairs of his family, the tabloids began calling him the Odd Father.
He would check himself into a hospital once a year for what his colleagues in the Mafia sarcastically referred to as tune-ups, so that he would have a paper trail showing that he had some, or giving the impression that he had some mental condition. And with the assistance of people around him and people in his family, he was able to cultivate this paper trail, giving the impression to anyone who looked at the cold medical records that here's someone who, year in, year out, was being treated for some form of mental illness.
Gigante knew how to protect himself, both publicly and privately.
Mr. Gigante was very clever in how he conducted business, and he limited his contacts with members of the family. If there were messages or items to be discussed regarding illegal activities conducted by the Genovese family, there would be messages passed on to people immediately surrounding him. Access to him was very limited. If the other family wanted to meet with him, more than likely they would have to send a message.
Gigante avoided the normal sit-downs or more formal meetings held regularly by other family bosses. He would take meetings when businesses demanded his attention. He and his visitors would stroll the sidewalks through the neighborhood, ensuring that surveillance wiretaps would not pick up any incriminating conversations. The always careful Gigante also suspected Ms. Esposito's phone was tapped, and it was. He never talked business on the phone. He would simply use a payphone or make arrangements to talk elsewhere. The FBI would not be able to use the Chin's own words to make a case against him. Other mobsters were not as smart. Sophisticated bugging operations were allowing the FBI to capture a multitude of other mob business on tape. In early 1985, the Justice Department was bearing down hard on a number of high-level organized crime figures. Most were being charged under the RICO Act. Though RICO had been around since the early 70s, it was only now receiving its first real test. Two of Gigante's men had gotten wind that the bosses of the Gambino and Lucchese families would soon be arrested. They wondered if the Chin was vulnerable. One commented that if he gets pinched, all those years in the asylum would be for nothing. On February 19th, the arrests of several crime family bosses were made. The next day, Vincent Gigante checked himself into the hospital and stayed a week. He had successfully avoided the indictment against the New York bosses. Among those arrested was Paul Castellano, head of the Gambino crime family. Prosecutors never brought him to trial. He was killed before they had the chance. By Cosa Nostra standards, the unsanctioned murders of Gambino boss Paul Castellano and his underboss Tommy Bellotti were unpardonable. Although John Gotti, a captain in the Gambino family, acted shocked at Castellano's death, it was widely believed that he was responsible. Within 2 weeks of the murders, Gotti had publicly taken over as boss. Vincent Gigante issued a subtle warning to Gotti. Without mentioning names, he told Gotti that the murderer would have to pay. It took 2 years, but in 1987, Gigante acted to avenge the murder of his friend and partner in mob business. Through his counselor, Bobby Manna, and some Lucchese family members, Gigante plotted to have Gotti killed. The planning session at a New Jersey restaurant was bugged, and because it was, the FBI saved John Gotti's life. If agents intercept information of a murder plot, they are required by law to try to prevent the killing. So based on the tape, agents warned Gotti. Acting on the FBI warning, John Gotti changed his plans on the day the murder was to take place. Because he was not where he was expected, the murder plot failed. Gigante, however, did not give up. He asked Vic Amuso, acting boss of the Lucchese family, to supervise another hit. It was up to Amuso and his men to work out the details.
And that was to have Amuso reach out to Al Diorco, one of his trusted men, just as Manna was one of Gigante's trusted men, and have Diorco use his contacts in other parts of the country to acquire a remote-controlled bomb.
But Gotti was arrested and imprisoned before the second plot could be carried out. He died of cancer while serving a life sentence for racketeering involving extortion and murder, including Castellano's. Meanwhile, the FBI had Chin's men on tape conspiring the murder. As the FBI's investigation into Genovese family operations continued, information about a corrupt construction scheme was coming to light. They learned that for years, much of the Genovese family income came from one segment of the construction industry, the window business. The family had managed to keep its hold on window replacement jobs for all of New York City's public housing projects.
We learned that at that time there was an enormous amount of money being put into refurbishing some of the New York City Housing Authority windows. There was an energy crisis underway, and the timing of this was ideal for the organized crime people to become more active in it. What we learned was that the Genovese family, along with 2 or 3 other families, were becoming involved in companies that were bidding and installing the windows in some of these housing projects. From the late 1970s up until the late 1980s, there was approximately $190 million worth of contracts given out by the City of New York for the window replacement industry.
It was classic mob business and a textbook example of racketeering. The Mafia took over an industry to the exclusion of legitimate businesses. Union officials were corrupted. In this case, Ironworkers Local 580. Bids were rigged, and companies or workers trying to play by the rules lost out. For years, the Lucchese and Genovese families operated their construction schemes autonomously. By the early 80s, they realized that a partnership would be much more profitable. By this time, the Lucchese family had a firm hold on Local 580, and the Genovese family had corrupted several contractors. They cooperated because it meant more business.
By using the Local 580 as a tool, they were able to exclude several contractors from coming in and bidding on some of these projects, and in essence created a somewhat of a monopoly for themselves.
On nearly all City Housing Authority work, and on much of the new construction for the city, the Genovese contractors and installers paid $2 a window. $1 went to the Lucchese family, 25 cents to the collector, and 75 cents to the boss for the family's role in handling the union. The other $1 went to the crooked union officials who looked the other way as jobs went to non-union workers. Refusal to cooperate often carried a penalty of violence. In the late 80s, a carpenters union delegate had both of his legs broken by Genovese men for refusing to cooperate, though he maintained that he was unable to get a good look at his attackers. And in 1992, a delegate from Local 580 was shot and killed coming out of his house on Long Island over a disagreement with his Cosa Nostra contracts. The Lucchese and Genovese family arrangement was working very smoothly. That is, until Peter Savino was persuaded to wear a wire. Savino was a Genovese soldier and point man for the window racket.
We built a case on him, a murder case on him, and it was sufficiently compelling that he realized, like many of these people, that he didn't want to die in jail. So what did he do? He decided to cooperate. And for an 18-month period made tape recordings of people in the Genovese family and people in the Lucchese family operating this scheme.
Vincent Gigante didn't realize Peter Savino was turning on him. He was happy with Savino's work and satisfied with the window scheme's progression. Savino kept track of the money. He managed the contracts. He supervised the bids. He arranged the payoffs. The boss was happy, but some Genovese family members began to suspect Savino. When bodies were found in the basement of a building he owned, Genovese members were surprised that he was never seriously investigated by law enforcement.
As a result of that, people speculated, well, Savino wasn't arrested, yet these bodies were found in a building that's tied to him. Maybe he's cooperating, but nobody was really sure.
Savino was a cash cow for Vincent Gigante. He was bringing in hundreds of thousands of dollars for the Genovese family every month. So when Gigante was told of Savino's betrayal, he chose not to believe it and initially refused to order him killed. Savino continued to wear the wire, trying to get other family members to acknowledge Chin and his position as boss of the family. Gigante's troops, however, could never be persuaded to break the boss's rule about not mentioning his name.
Remember Uniseal? Vincent had said when it came time to bid. Oh, okay, I'll mention him. He had said to go out and bid the work.
It was, don't mention that name. How can you talk like that? That was pretty damning proof. Even though it didn't give you a specific crime, it told you that this was a man to be feared. It was hardly somebody who was incompetent.
Shortly thereafter, it came to Gigante's attention that Savino was in fact cooperating. Furious at this betrayal, Gigante ordered the murder of Peter Savino. By that time, the FBI had relocated Savino well out of Genevieve's family reach, but not before he supplied agents with thousands of hours of taped conversations.
Mr. Savino was also in a position to provide us with the historical aspects of how this scheme developed, his relationship with the leaders of both the Lucchese and Genovese crime family, and what their participation was in this thing. Mr. Savino also was able to tell us how the various members of all of these families interacted with Local 580, which was used, again, as the tool to make the scheme work.
The FBI was successfully employing the RICO laws to bring down New York's most powerful bosses. As a result, high-ranking family members saw that their only way to avoid long prison terms was to cooperate. Among them were Gambino family underboss Salvatore "Sammy the Bull" Gravano. Gigante was finally arrested and charged under the RICO laws with ordering 6 people murdered, conspiring to kill 3 others, and at least 24 counts of racketeering. In short, Gigante was charged with being the boss of the Genovese crime family. But Gigante still had his mental illness history to fall back on.
Mr. Gigante was indicted in May of 1990, and a second indictment was filed against him in June of 1993. The case against Mr. Gigante was unusual, that it spanned several years before it actually went to trial. He eventually went to trial in June of 1997. During that period of time, the issue that was before the courts was that whether he was competent to stand trial or not. That issue was finally resolved in 1996.
7 years after his arrest, a federal district judge declared Vincent Gigante competent to stand trial. Vincent the Chin Gigante was 69 years old when a jury convicted him of conspiring to kill 3 Mafia figures, including Gotti and Savino. He was also found guilty of extortion and union payoff conspiracies in the window replacement scheme. But jurors failed to convict him on charges of directly ordering 6 murders. Now that Gigante was convicted, his defense lawyers argued that he was not fit to be sentenced. They claimed he was too old, too frail, and too mentally incompetent to understand the punishment. While awaiting sentencing, Gigante was confined to a prison hospital and examined by several doctors. Gigante was given several PET scans, a procedure that uses a radioactive tracer to measure brain chemistry. A 1991 scan, first read as normal, was later found to be too flawed to use in diagnosis. A 1993 scan did show some abnormalities. But at least one expert, Dr. Jonathan Brody, judged these abnormalities as not consistent with dementia. Dr. Brody is an attending psychiatrist at New York's Bellevue Hospital and a professor at New York University's School of Medicine. He also conducts research on schizophrenia.
Mr. Gigante, at the time of the scan, was purportedly taking medication that affects the brain. And because it affects the brain, it affects brain chemistry, and brain chemistry is what a PET scan is all about.
Gigante was taking an antipsychotic medication, and antidepressants, a low-potency tranquilizer, and sleeping pills. So Dr. Brody was skeptical about the PET scan, but had yet to examine the patient.
When the three of us entered the observation room, the examining room where he was then brought, I was struck at first by his appearance, which I said made me think, oh my God, he really is sick. I've missed the boat. He's really very sick. He came in wearing a bathrobe, he was shuffling, he was mumbling, he was making allusions to God.
But as the examination progressed, some of Gigante's actions began to raise doubts.
But one of the things that really struck me was that I didn't note at the time, but I noted a few seconds later, was when I put out my hand for him to shake it, he didn't shake it. And that's a very automatic behavior. You put your hand out, your worst enemy can put his hand out to you, and you tend to take it.
How about this way?
When Gigante was asked the names of his children, he didn't know. When he was asked where he lived, he didn't know.
And yet, these are things that people tend not to forget. You know, the brain in a dementia tends to work on the process of accounting. The last in, first out. So recent memory tends to be lost, but that's why people who are very demented can often remember very well events from long ago, even if they can't remember recent events. Well, he was not consistent on that. Indeed, he was asked the question about who the President of the United States was, which is a standard question on a psychiatric mental status evaluation. And he scratched his head and he looked perplexed and he said, I should know that. I should know that answer. It's in there somewhere. And some more questions were asked. He said, I really should know that. And then finally he said, Bush. George Bush. And I sat there and thought, oh, he remembered the question. What was striking was not that the answer was incorrect. What was striking was that the question was remembered despite all of the interfering questions.
And there were other red flags. He seemed to understand abstract concepts. Dr. Brody asked Gigante if he was proud of his children.
Now, pride is really quite an abstract notion. And his response was, yes, they're all working. Legitimate jobs. Legitimacy? Well, that wasn't even a question. Legitimate implies yet something else, that he was able to abstract from the question some intent as to what the question was involved with, and awareness of a distinction between legitimacy and illegitimacy. And here was a man who didn't know what month it was. He didn't know if he was in a hospital.
These and other inconsistencies contributed to Dr. Brody's conclusion that Gigante did not suffer from progressive dementia, vascular dementia, or schizophrenia. Guards assigned to watch Gigante during his pre-sentencing hospitalization also found his behavior normal. They testified that he was active around his prison hospital cell and polite to the hospital staff. He did not need help to shower, to groom himself, or to feed himself.
The lawyers all put in affidavits that they couldn't communicate with Vincent Gigante at all. Well, when he was in jail, he managed to speak with the prison counselors. When you sort of talk to the sort of low-level people in jail who have to take care of inmates on a day-to-day basis, it turns out He knew exactly what had happened. He knew he had been on trial. He knew that Gravano had testified against him and didn't have very nice things to say about him. He knew that his sentencing was upcoming. He knew what the issue was before Judge Weinstein as to that he had to decide that he was competent to be sentenced. It was completely at odds with what his lawyers were telling Judge Weinstein.
Some psychiatrists thought Gigante really was incompetent. Others thought he was faking. 5 months and dozens of tests later, the judge ruled. The judge said, "In short, the defendant's cognitive and emotional capacity and his communication skills are equivalent to other 69-year-old defendants with limited education. No hallucinations interfere with his abilities to participate in sentencing. He understands the fundamentals of criminal substantive law and procedure. He is deliberately feigning mental illness to avoid punishment which he fears. Defendant is competent to be sentenced and to serve an appropriate term in prison." Shaliro described efforts of the FBI and prosecutors as historic and courageous.
This has been a battle that certainly I've been involved with for the last 20 years, and certainly I think agents that will continue that on over the next 5 or 6 years. If the effort could be sustained and the resources maintained, I think we're on the verge of really reducing the effects and the impact of the Cosa Nostra.
To be sure, the government's legal victory in the Gigante case was partial. The jury, after all, failed to convict him of the 6 murder charges. He was originally sentenced to 12 years. In 2003, he pleaded guilty to obstruction of justice and earned 3 more years, finally admitting in court that he had been faking insanity the entire time.